I see yellow tape, police cars, police everywhere. Judy had been beaten, and they didn't know where the kids were. We had no idea who would do this. Who would hurt Judy? Why would someone beat Judy? My concern was, where's the children? I prayed a lot. Praying for the kids, praying that Judy would survive. I don't think that they thought Judy was going to live.
So at this point now, they see we have a body down. It's a female and she's moaning, she's in pain. It appeared her attacker bashed her head against those rail ties. Judy's been beaten, left for dead. She was the only witness to what occurred as far as we knew. The concern was that she was not going to survive. And whoever had done this was still out there. But you gotta do what you gotta do. All hands on deck. Let's find out who did this.
The picture represents the start of when Judy was looking for a new life. A new beginning right here in Omaha. Just think that I wish they had stayed in Minneapolis. Because maybe if they hadn't have come, maybe things would have turned out differently. My cousin and Judy were high school sweethearts, and she's just part of the family. I love Judy. I always considered her my cousin. When my cousin and Judy broke up, she said that she wanted to have something better for her and her kids. I told her she could live with me until she got herself together, found a job, and a place. Judy was excited to be here in Omaha for her and Tremar and Latara. She got a job. She's going out, meeting people. She's happy. You can see that she's happy. I was happy for all three. One of the things that bothers me the most, that plays over and over in my mind, she wanted something different, something better. And I thought that she was going to find that. And that did not turn out to be the case. Eventually, she left my house and moved to her apartment. I feel like maybe if she had been at my house, this wouldn't have happened.
So what we're walking down into is an industrial area, rail yard. It was pretty chilly that morning, probably about 30 degrees with a little bit of a light dusting of snow. So the officers respond to the area. They notice some blood, and then they hear moaning. So at this point now, they see we have a body down, and it's a female, and she's moaning, she's in pain. was conscious. She was adamant that she had not fallen and that she was beaten. It had appeared her attacker had simply bashed her head against those rail ties. The massive amount of damage that was done to the back of her head, her skull, and her flesh, which was torn open from these ties. The back of her head was here. The wound on the back of her head, the blood was dripping this way with it pooling around the top of the tie here. So the aggressor actually, in this manner, with the head smashing against the tie. You could tell the blood had been dripping down the back of the tie and coagulating down at the bottom. So she had been there for some time. At some point, she had made her way from where the rail ties are here over to the brush area. From what we could tell, the body was dragged in this direction here. The blood trail followed as well. Well, ultimately, she ended up over here in this area, which is where she was found. When the first responding officers had asked her if she knew who had beat her, she nodded her head in the affirmative that she did, but she could not come up with a name. She was transported by medics up to the hospital. She's placed in a coma. So any conversation after that ceased. The concern was that she was not going to survive. So now this is going to turn into a homicide investigation. When I arrived to the scene, it had been already quadrant off. I'm looking around to see if there's anything else that I need to pay attention to. And we noticed some footprints over in the brush where she was found. Some evidence that we found were a cigarette butt. We found one within a few feet of where the body was. That was collected in the hopes of collecting DNA for whoever was here at the time to be able to use later once we located a suspect. I advised her that Judy had been severely beaten and was in the hospital. I was asked, well, what about the children? And my heart stopped. I was like, children, what do you mean? And she's like, no, she has 2 kids. Do you know where they are? And I said, no. Tell me more. So she told me the ages, the names, and gave us an address. So time is of the essence at this point. Judy's been beaten, left for dead. The hunt was on to find the kids.
I started getting all these phone calls from Minneapolis. And I finally answered the phone because they won't stop calling me. And it's my cousin. He said that Judy had been beaten and they didn't know where the kids were. I was thinking, who would hurt Judy? And all I could hear on the call was the kid's grandmother saying, go find my grandbabies. I see yellow tape, police everywhere. There's a police officer, and I stop. I'm looking for my cousins. Their mom was beaten really bad. Are they here? And she goes, can you go to the police department? They need to ask you some questions. And I'm like, For what? What kind of questions? Concerning what? It's like, did Judy die? Tell me, did Judy die? Where are my cousins? It put me in high anxiety. This can't be happening. Tell me where the kids are. They have to be terrified.
Judy's apartment was just right around the corner from the railroad tracks. We went to the apartment, didn't get an answer at the door. I believe was in my mind and my partner's mind that the kids were not there. The landlord was able to unlock the door for us. There were no signs of forced entry. The residence itself did not appear to be ransacked. There was a phone that was on the floor. The receiver was off the hook. As we entered into the apartment, it was dark. We hit the light switch on. Once we turned the corner, you can see directly into a bedroom. It's there that we saw the body of a young female laying on the bed in a manner that was just not a natural position. You're kind of stunned. Just can't believe what you're seeing. So we began searching the rest of the apartment. And in the bathroom, we ran across a juvenile young black male in the bathtub who was in an unnatural position and was also deceased. This is how he was found by us. For whatever reason, in my mind's eye, this is exactly how I remember first seeing him. There wasn't any question in our mind who they were. We were fairly certain it was Latara and Tremar. I was sickened at what I saw and how somebody could do that to the kids. It's a lot to grasp and a lot to deal with. So yeah, not an easy scene to walk through. It's been 20 years, right? It's still, the emotions hit. So you soak it all in, you know, you gotta do what you gotta do. And game on, all hands on deck. Let's find out who did this. The bodies were photographed and removed. I believe both bodies were removed probably about 6 to 8 hours later and taken to the medical examiners for an autopsy to take place whether it's the next day or the following day. We remained at that scene for several days just to ensure that we didn't miss anything. During that time frame, Judy was still in a coma, so there was no attempts at re-interviewing her to get anything additional from her about what happened, nor could we share with her what had happened to her kids. In Judy's apartment, we located several items of evidence that we wanted to make sure and send to the lab. Those items included the used condom in the bathroom, and there was a soiled towel at the feet of where Latara was laying. So hopefully we would be able to get the DNA off of that on down the road. And that's kind of where we were at with it. Whoever had done this was still out there.
I go to the police department And I go into this room and they ask me these questions about Judy. Why are you asking me all these questions? Did Judy die? Tell me. My concern was, where's the children? Where's Latara? Where's Tremar? They said they couldn't tell me. I thought that if I answered their questions, that I would be taking the kids with me, that there would not be a need for a CPS to continue to hold the kids. It's like almost 10 o'clock. They took me back to my house, and that's when I went and looked at the TV. They're bringing the kids' bodies out in body bags. That I just left hours ago, and you had me down there answering questions, and you didn't tell me that my cousins were dead. Knowing that the kids were murdered was overwhelming, scary, because we had no idea who would do this. I prayed a lot, praying that Judy would survive. I don't think that they gave her a good chance of surviving. I don't think that they thought Judy was going to live.
When I first woke up, I was confused and I was scared, trying to figure out where am I and why am I here, what happened. I remember seeing the nurse, then all of a sudden I remember the nurse running out and a bunch of nurses and a doctor come running in my room, and I'm just looking around. It's like, I kept thinking, why can't I remember a lot? It's like, where are my kids? Why haven't they called me? Do they know where I'm at? It's like, I need my kids. And I kept asking my mom, have you talked to Latara and Tremar? And she said, yeah, I did, Mom. They're okay. They're fine. Because the doctors, they said, don't tell me about the kids yet because I could go into shock. I could go back into a coma. Something I'll never forget. She said, Judy, there's something I gotta tell you. I'm like, okay, what? She said it's about Latara and Tremar. I said, what about them? She said, Judy, they're gone. I'm like, what do you mean they're gone? She said, Judy, they're dead. I said, you're lying. Why are you lying on your grandkids like that? Why? She said, they are gone. They died. I'm like, what? You're lying. Why is everybody lying? She said they were murdered. And then the doctor came in. She said, I'm just going to give you this shot. It's going to calm you down, let you sleep for a while.
This would be Tara. Tremar. Good-looking kid. Fun grin on his face. Yeah, I can't imagine what they were thinking, what was going through their mind when all that was happening. This case in particular was disturbing to me, the fact that it involved kids and in the manner that they suffered before they were killed. And to know that a human being is undergoing that, that's probably the most bothersome thing about it. I wasn't gonna let those two die in vain and have Judy not be able to know who did this. Judy was the only witness to what occurred as far as we knew. Judy was interviewed at the hospital to see if she could recall anything, which didn't really reveal much of anything. So we needed to do our due diligence, get out there and find out what happened to her. We are wanting to talk to anybody and everybody who knows anything about Judy that could provide us with any leads of who she knows, who she hangs out with. And the name Lee kept coming up. Lee was somebody new to Judy who she was dating. Family had not met Lee before. We did not know anything other than Lee. Lee first name, Lee last name, what about this Lee? Even when she got out of her coma, she was not able to even put together who Lee was. The DNA that was collected from both crime scenes were submitted to the lab, which were the towel left in the bedroom, the condom at the apartment, and the cigarette butt at the railroad tracks. When the DNA results did come back, that indicates the same person was at both crime scenes. It simply came back as an unidentified male. So at that point, no, we were not able to correlate the DNA that was collected to a particular person. Judy had several boyfriends, and we were trying to interview them and get some DNA samples from them as well. One gentleman whose name was Lee initially was cooperative, but he refused to give any DNA. So of course that piqued our interest. Why not? You were cooperative all of a sudden up until now when you know we want DNA. So our focus was tight on him. He agreed to do a polygraph. The results were somewhat indicative of not being completely truthful. We take that sample from him, that is submitted, and ultimately the tests come back to reveal that he was not involved. But we were still trying to determine who the Lee was. We are at a little bit of a standstill. We needed more information from Judy. Now, she suffered severe head trauma, so is she ever going to remember what occurred to her?
I really wanted my memory. I wanted to know who took my kids. I wanted to get justice for my kids, that I had to get my memory back. It took months for me to start remembering things. I could be asleep, wake up, and I got a memory, or I could just be sitting, talking to somebody, and all of a sudden the memory would pop up. It's weird, but scary. A lot of times it's like, okay, did this really happen? Or is my mind playing tricks on me? When I got out the hospital, I felt real alone. I feel like nobody don't understand. It's like they're looking at me like, you killed your kids and you can't remember. I didn't kill them, but I know who killed them, and I just can't remember. And I kept thinking, Judy, you're dumb. You're dumb. Come on now, you can do this. I was real angry at myself. Real angry. Then one day, I was sitting outside on the porch. A detective had came and left his card and said to let them know when I got some of my memory back. And then, I don't know, it was like a light bulb in my head. And I'm like, I remember his name. His name was Lee. I was outside of Rochelle's house, and this nice looking car pulls up, and he pulls up and saying hi, and I look good to him. It was flattering. And I asked who he was, and he told me his name. I just knew him as Lee. Now I wish I never did speak to him, but I did. Lee came over to the apartment and asked if I could go out riding with him. Latar and Tremar knew who I'd left with. I'm finna leave with Lee. I'll be back. They said, okay. So I left with Lee. We were sitting on that hill. We were talking and drinking beer. So Lee said, I'm gonna go get me a beer. You want another beer? And I said, yeah. And he walked back to the car and he opened the trunk of the car. I seen Lee get a beer out, so then I turned back around. And that's as far as my memory goes. That's it. That's all I remember. After I remember who Lee was, I started crying then. I said, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Latar and Tremar. Now we gotta call the detectives, because you got some of your memory back and this is gonna help.
That is the house that we shared. It has so many memories. I just had one rule, and that was no men in and out of my house. And she agreed. One night, I came downstairs, and Judy's door was closed. And I hear Keith's sled playing. So I knock on the door. And Judy goes to the door in a little red negligee. And I'm just like, do you have someone in there? And And she says, yes. I'm like, I told you, don't help me. And I'm like, whoever it is, I gotta go. And this guy comes out, and he never looks at me. It was strange to me that this man never even looked at me. He seemed kind of weird, kind of creepy. He's like, I've been out here dating a little bit. I'm like, don't trust everyone. Take it from me. She's like, oh, it'll be okay. I think she was naive.
I remember talking to a psychologist, and then I just remember I kept saying that I don't understand why. Why did he try to kill me? Why did he kill my kids? And then, I don't know, I can't explain, just again, a light popped up in my head that I helped him rob somebody. And it's like, oh my God. Lee had said, well, Judy, I got a proposition for you. Me and my cousin, we know how we can get some money. And I said, what's that? And he said he knew about this place in Omaha that sells old cars. Lee told me all I would have to do is go into the car place and act like I'm interested in buying a car. All I would have to do is distract the guy. So I was like, okay, yeah, I can do that. But I had told Lee, I don't want no guns involved. I'm scared of guns. And Lee promised me, oh no, ain't gonna be no guns. Nothing like that. We just need you to distract him. Okay. All right, I'm willing to do that. Gullible me, goofy me, dumb me. Now, I didn't remember all parts of the robbery, but I remember being there. Lee came in and I'm startled, scared, because they had guns. So, oh my God, I'm thinking in my head, I'm finna get killed now. He lied to me. And I ran. I was running for my life. And all of a sudden, I heard footsteps behind me. I was thinking it was the police saying, oh my God, I'm caught. I'm caught. I knew it. I should have known better. But it was Lee and his cousin. I followed them to the car. I got in the car and said, take me home now. Take me home now. And he's like, we got money. He'd gotten the guy's credit cards and checks, and I told him, I want to go home. What did I just do? I know better than this. You actually helped somebody rob someone. And that wasn't right. I was scared. Oh, I was scared. It was like, oh Lord, please forgive me. I was praying and kept saying, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I was thinking he was trying to kill me because I knew about the robbery and that I was gonna talk. And my kids could tell him who I left with. And I believe that's why he killed my kids. So my kids couldn't talk. I started blaming myself again. That it was my fault. I put part blame on my children's death because of that robbery. That's what I really believed. When I started remembering details of the robbery, it was scary. I thought for sure, if I tell the police, I'm gonna be in trouble. But they thanked me for telling them.
That was enough detail for us to then go research other incidents that occurred during that time frame to match up the same details. We found an incident that involved the same type of detail, pretty much down to the T. In looking at that incident, we discovered that a suspect had been arrested. He had bonded out of jail. We interviewed him, and he did in fact admit to the robbery and provided the suspect's name who assisted him. The person that he named was Arthur Lee Gales. So that now defined for us who Lee was. He explained his physical stature, gold tooth, bald head, the type of vehicle he drove, the location of where Mr. Gales lived, everything that we were looking for, and that he dated Judy. And the next morning, we served the warrant. He's nervous, takes out a cigarette. I recall my partner and I kind of looking at each other. It was just like an instant little static of electricity between the two of us. It's the same brand of cigarette that we find at the scene at the tracks. We knew this was him. It's Arthur Lee Gales. It's pretty much the same expression he had on his face when I was staring at him, when he was smoking a cigarette. No emotion, just dead eyes. Not much of anybody, just kind of a shell of a person. The size 12 shoe and brand shoe print that we found at the scene was the same shoe that we found in Gale's residence. We have a warrant to get DNA from him. We take that sample from him, that is submitted, and ultimately the tests come back to reveal that the DNA is a match. We finally did it. This is our guy.
When I found out that this Arthur Lee Gales murdered the kids, I'm totally confused. And then it dawns on me that this Lee guy is the guy that was in my house. That's terrifying to think about, having someone in your house that's capable of doing the things that he did. This guy could have killed all of us. I love this picture of Tremar. This is a painful reminder of Latara and Tremar. They're just babies. They were just babies. They didn't die naturally. They didn't just, peacefully die. But his smile smile is just, it was just so full of happiness and joy and a loving personality and I'll take it away.
There were several theories as far as what occurred between Gales and Judy. Did they have a fight? Maybe there was some discussion about the robbery itself, her involvement. Maybe she was unhappy to the extent of what Gales involved her in. There are a variety of different hypotheses that were discussed. Nothing really was ever settled on as far as what ultimately led to the fight. Judy was not charged in the robbery. It was decided due to the amount of trauma that she was already undergoing and the homicide of her 2 children, that would just be left alone. Nobody wants to see bad things happen to children. And when you witness it and now you're dealing with it yourself and start to finish. So yeah, you take a lot of it home with you.
My doctors didn't want me to attend the trial. They said I could have a seizure because of the shock. The only day of the trial that I could attend was when they gave the verdict. And he came in, I looked dead at him, looks could kill, he'd be dead, but he came in and he looked dead at me and couldn't take his eyes off me. I suppose he was surprised to see me sitting there. And when the jury said guilty for me, and guilty for Latara, and guilty for Trayvon, I said, now justice has been served. I want him to die. He took my life. He took my children. I wanted to see Arthur Lee Gales suffer. I really did. So in a way, I feel like I was cheated. They say I'm disabled.
ITDM Truak Ki Bat Dao, Tudor Ban Kung Kap La, Florida cold case cracked after decades. Hidden evidence shocks detectives. Nia La Vu and Da Duok Fa. Tui Mien, Trong Yu Kor Truok Du Ban Kung Noi De La Mot Vu and Chua Ko Loi Gi. De Tran Mao Thuan, Duoi De Min Si Viet Fan One Theo Dung Tudor, Mot Vu and Duok Fa Saw Nu Thap Kai, Dung Loi Jiu Kong Ki Bien Vadn On. The old evidence box was never supposed to change anyone's life. It had been sitting on a forgotten shelf inside a climate-controlled storage room for more than 25 years, sealed beneath fading tape and covered with a thin layer of dust. Hundreds of investigators had walked past it. New detectives replaced old ones. Sheriffs retired. Prosecutors came and went. Florida changed. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath new highways and shopping centers. Yet the small cardboard box remained exactly where it had always been, carrying a case number that had become almost invisible with time. To most people, it was another cold case. To one detective, it was a nightmare waiting to wake up. Nobody expected that a single overlooked piece of evidence hidden inside that forgotten container would eventually send shockwaves through an entire community. Because some secrets refused to stay buried forever. The summer of 1998 arrived with the kind of relentless Florida heat that blurred the horizon and turned every afternoon into a haze of shimmering asphalt. Tourists crowded the beaches. Families filled amusement parks. Local television stations talked endlessly about tropical storms building far out in the Atlantic. Life seemed ordinary. Until the morning everything changed. At 6:42 a.m., a maintenance worker entered an abandoned orange grove on the outskirts of a quiet county road, expecting another routine inspection before developers cleared the land for new construction. Instead, he noticed something strange beneath a cluster of palmetto bushes. Freshly disturbed earth. The smell reached him before his eyes understood what he was seeing. He immediately backed away. Minutes later, deputies surrounded the grove with yellow crime scene tape as helicopters circled overhead. By lunchtime, every local television station interrupted regular programming. Authorities confirmed that human remains had been discovered. The victim appeared to have been buried years earlier. No identification. No obvious clues. No witnesses. Only questions. As forensic teams carefully removed the remains from the shallow grave, detectives realized they weren't looking at a recent homicide. Nature had erased almost everything. Rain. Humidity. Insects. Time itself had worked against investigators. The medical examiner estimated the victim had been dead for years. Possibly decades. What remained was little more than bones, fragments of clothing, and several personal items that seemed painfully ordinary. A faded wristwatch. A rusted key. Several buttons. One inexpensive necklace. Nothing screamed murder. Yet everything about the burial suggested someone had desperately wanted this person to disappear forever. The discovery shocked residents. The orange grove had been part of the community for generations. Children played nearby. Hunters crossed the property every season. Nobody had ever reported anything unusual. If a killer had buried someone there, they had done it without attracting attention. Or perhaps someone had noticed. And never spoke. Detectives began reconstructing the victim's identity the only way they could. Dental records. Bone measurements. Old missing person reports. For weeks, investigators compared files dating back years. Boxes filled conference rooms. Retired officers were called back to answer questions. Families who had spent decades wondering whether their loved ones were alive suddenly received unexpected phone calls from law enforcement. Hope returned. Then disappeared again. Every lead collapsed. No match. No identification. No name. Without knowing who the victim was, detectives couldn't determine motive. Couldn't establish timeline. Couldn't identify suspects. Couldn't even confirm where the murder had occurred. The crime scene might not have been the murder scene at all. Whoever buried the body could have transported it from anywhere in the state. The investigation grew larger. Then colder. Months turned into years. The case file expanded while answers remained painfully absent. Every anniversary brought another newspaper article asking the same haunting question. Who was buried beneath the orange trees? Eventually, the headlines stopped. New crimes demanded attention. New victims needed justice. The unknown victim became another file stacked among hundreds of others inside the sheriff's evidence archive. Officially active. Unofficially forgotten. But there was something about the case that refused to let certain detectives move on. Retired investigator Daniel Mercer often admitted that the unidentified burial haunted him more than any solved homicide. Not because of the violence. Because of the silence. Every murder tells a story. This one refused to speak. Years passed. Technology evolved. DNA science advanced beyond anything investigators in 1998 could have imagined. Cases once considered impossible suddenly reopened across America. Cold cases that had gathered dust for decades began producing arrests through methods that barely existed when the original investigations ended. Families finally received answers. Communities finally found closure. Detectives across Florida started reviewing forgotten evidence using modern forensic techniques. One by one, old boxes returned from storage. Including the Orange Grove file. The evidence inventory appeared disappointingly small. Several photographs. Soil samples. Clothing fragments. Personal belongings. Hair fibers. Biological material collected from beneath the victim's clothing. In 1998, laboratory technology had found nothing useful. Now, everything looked different. Forensic analysts examined every item under equipment capable of detecting microscopic traces invisible to previous generations. Nothing escaped attention. Every fiber. Every stain. Every grain of soil. The process took months. The results surprised everyone. One tiny biological sample contained enough preserved genetic material for a complete DNA profile. Investigators stared silently at the laboratory report. They finally had something. Not a suspect. Not a confession. Something even more powerful. A genetic fingerprint. The sheriff's office immediately submitted the profile through every available law enforcement database. Days passed. No match. Weeks passed. Still nothing. The unknown victim remained unknown. Frustration returned. Until one investigator proposed an idea that, years earlier, would have sounded almost impossible. What if the answer wasn't inside criminal databases? What if it had never been there? Instead of searching for suspects, search for relatives. The proposal sparked debate throughout the department. Genealogical DNA investigations remained controversial. Complicated. Expensive. Time-consuming. Yet officials approved the request. Private laboratories specializing in forensic genealogy began constructing family trees from distant DNA relatives scattered across the country. The process resembled solving an enormous puzzle with thousands of missing pieces. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. Unknown branches. Adoptions. Name changes. Every generation created new complications. Researchers spent months following paper trails stretching back nearly a century. Birth certificates. Marriage licenses. Military records. Obituaries. Old newspaper announcements. One family branch repeatedly pointed toward Central Florida. Another toward southern Georgia. Slowly, a possible identity emerged. Detectives refused to celebrate. Genealogical predictions required confirmation. Hope had disappointed them before. They contacted surviving relatives. Collected reference DNA. Waited. The laboratory called 3 weeks later. The unidentified victim finally had a name. After more than 2 decades. Silence filled the conference room. Some investigators smiled. Others simply lowered their heads. Because identifying the victim solved only one mystery. It created dozens more. According to family members, the victim had vanished in the early 1990s. The disappearance barely attracted media attention. There had been no statewide search. No national headlines. No television specials. At the time, relatives believed the victim had simply left voluntarily. Arguments had occurred within the family. Financial difficulties existed. The possibility of starting over somewhere else seemed believable. Years passed. Phone calls stopped. Letters never arrived. Eventually, hope faded into painful acceptance. Nobody imagined the missing relative had spent decades beneath an orange grove less than 100 miles away. Detectives reopened every original missing person record connected to the victim. Something immediately stood out. Several witness statements had never been fully investigated. One neighbor remembered hearing an argument during the victim's final night. Another recalled seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked outside the residence. A co-worker claimed the victim mentioned feeling frightened during the weeks before disappearing. Back then, none of those details seemed significant. Today, they sounded entirely different. Investigators tracked down surviving witnesses. Many had moved. Some had died. Others struggled to remember events buried beneath 30 years of ordinary life. Human memory had become another crime scene. Unreliable. Incomplete. Fading. Still, tiny fragments began aligning. A waitress remembered serving the victim coffee with an unidentified man just days before the disappearance. A gas station employee vaguely recognized an old composite sketch. A retired mechanic recalled repairing a truck matching witness descriptions. Individually, nothing seemed decisive. Together, patterns emerged. Patterns no one had recognized decades earlier. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Inside the original evidence inventory, investigators found an envelope marked simply miscellaneous. The envelope had received almost no attention during the first investigation because its contents appeared insignificant. Several dirt-covered receipts. A broken plastic object. An old keychain. And one tiny piece of fabric. Barely larger than a thumbnail. It had never been tested. Never photographed in detail. Never discussed in investigative reports. Someone had simply placed it inside the envelope and moved on. Modern forensic examination transformed that forgotten fabric into the most important evidence in the entire case. Embedded deep within the fibers, analysts detected biological material. Not from the victim. From someone else. The laboratory repeated the testing. Then repeated it again. Every result matched. Detectives suddenly found themselves holding something they had searched for over 25 years. DNA from a possible killer. Nobody spoke as the report circulated around the room. Veteran investigators understood exactly what it meant. The case that everyone believed had died in an evidence warehouse had just taken its first real breath in decades. Outside the sheriff's office, the Florida sun continued shining exactly as it had on the day the victim disappeared. Traffic flowed. Children laughed. People drove past the old orange grove without realizing that beneath years of silence, forgotten mistakes, and overlooked evidence, a story that someone had spent decades trying to erase was beginning to surface once again, and this time, the evidence was no longer willing to remain silent. The report did not feel real at first. It sat on the desk like any other sheet of paper, thin and unremarkable, the kind of document investigators had handled thousands of times before. But the words printed on it carried a weight that did not belong in a room like this, or any room at all, because what it described had not existed in 1998. Not in Florida. Not in this county. Not in the world these detectives had originally worked in. A partial DNA profile had been isolated from the fabric. And it did not belong to the victim. For a moment, nobody moved. Not because they were afraid, but because every experienced investigator in the room understood the same thing at the same time. This was the first real direction the case had ever had. After decades of dust, silence, and dead ends, something inside the evidence box had finally pointed outward instead of inward. But a DNA profile alone was not a name. It was a question disguised as science. The forensic genealogy team began their work immediately, uploading the profile into expanded kinship databases built from voluntary submissions, ancestry mapping services, and public records. The system did not search for criminals. It searched for distance, for fragments, for the faint genetic echoes of someone who had once been close enough to leave a trace in the world. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. And slowly, a pattern began to form. The DNA did not lead to one person. It led to branches. Family branches that stretched across state lines like fractured veins. A cluster in northern Florida. Another in Alabama. A weaker connection in Georgia. Each branch alone meant nothing. But together, they formed a narrowing funnel that kept pulling investigators toward one specific region outside Tampa. A name surfaced in old records. Then disappeared again. Then resurfaced in a different spelling. Then again in a marriage certificate from the late 1990s. The system was not giving them a suspect. It was giving them a ghost who had learned how to move through paperwork without ever staying still long enough to be caught. Detective Mercer returned to the case file for the first time in years. He did not speak much during the briefing. He simply read. Slowly. Carefully. Like a man listening to a voice he had almost forgotten. The genealogy team highlighted a potential match cluster. One individual stood out not because the DNA confirmed identity, but because everything around the DNA refused to let the name settle. A man who had lived in Florida during the early 1990s. A man who had worked in short-term construction jobs near multiple counties. A man who appeared in employment records, then vanished for years, then reappeared under a slightly different legal identity. Not a criminal record. Not yet. Just inconsistencies. And in cold case investigations, inconsistencies were often the beginning of everything. The name was Daniel Kessler. At least, that was the most recent version of it. Detectives did not rush to conclusions. Experience had taught them that genealogy could point toward proximity, not guilt. But something about this particular trail felt different. The timing aligned too closely with the victim's disappearance. The geography overlapped too precisely with witness accounts from the early 1990s. And most importantly, one of the distant genetic matches came from a confirmed relative whose family history included a shared connection to the same rural corridor where the orange grove had once stood. It was enough to justify surveillance. Not accusation. Not arrest. Surveillance. A quiet observation was arranged within 48 hours. A small team was deployed to a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Tampa, where property records indicated a residence tied to one of Kessler's known aliases. The house itself was unremarkable. Single story. Faded paint. A driveway cracked by heat and age. A mailbox that leaned slightly to one side like it had stopped caring about standing upright. But what mattered was not the house. It was the man who occasionally came and went from it. Detectives observed from unmarked vehicles parked far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to capture patterns. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The subject left early in the morning. Returned in the evening. Purchased groceries. Filled gas. Avoided attention in the way most ordinary people do when they believe no one is watching. But patterns always reveal themselves eventually. On the third day of surveillance, the subject did something that changed the tone of the entire operation. He drove south. Not to work. Not to errands. But along a route that led directly toward the county where the Orange Grove case had originated. Detective Mercer was notified immediately. He did not order intervention. Not yet. Instead, he instructed the team to follow at a distance. The vehicle was an older pickup truck. Red paint faded to a dull rust tone. The same model that had appeared in a witness statement written 25 years earlier, dismissed at the time as unreliable memory. Now it was moving again. Alive. Real. Traveling through modern highways built over roads that had once been quiet and isolated. The truck eventually exited near rural land that had changed significantly since 1998. The Orange Grove was gone, replaced by industrial development and fenced construction zones. But the subject did not stop there. He continued driving until he reached a narrow dirt access road leading toward an area marked for restricted entry. That was when he pulled over. And sat there. Engine running. Hands on the wheel. Not moving. Not calling anyone. Just watching the land. Detectives observed from a distance as minutes stretched unnaturally long. There was no legal reason to intervene. No probable cause. No visible criminal act. But there was something unsettling about the stillness, as if the subject was not visiting a place, but remembering one. Then, without warning, he turned the truck around and left. No stops. No detours. Just departure. Back toward Tampa. Back toward routine life. Back toward the version of himself that had survived for decades without interruption. But something had shifted. Because now the investigation had direction. And direction meant pressure. Within days, investigators obtained a warrant to search historical records tied to Kessler's various identities. What they found did not provide a confession, but it did something almost more important. It connected him to proximity networks that placed him in overlapping locations with the victim during the final weeks before the disappearance. Employment rosters. Temporary housing logs. A short-term lease under a name that no longer legally existed. A storage unit rented and closed within a 3-month window in 1993. That storage unit became the next target. Except when investigators arrived, it no longer existed. The facility had been demolished years earlier. Records had been partially lost during corporate restructuring. The physical space had been converted into a commercial complex. Another dead end. But not a complete one. Because forensic genealogy had already done something else in parallel. It had identified a second, smaller genetic connection. A woman living in another part of Florida. A distant relative who had once shared a household address with Kessler during the late 1980s. Detectives approached her carefully. Not as a suspect. Not as a witness. At first, simply as a family connection. The interview took place in her home, a modest apartment filled with personal photographs and the ordinary clutter of a life lived without interruption. She appeared confused by the questions at first, defensive in the way people become when strangers begin pulling threads from their past. But when Kessler's name was mentioned, her expression changed. Not fear. Not recognition. Something more complicated. Reluctance. She admitted she had not spoken to him in years. That he had a tendency to start over. That he did not like staying in one place too long. That conversations about his past were often avoided. Then she said something that shifted the investigation again. He had once worked out near Orange Groves in Central Florida. She did not remember exactly when. But she remembered him coming home late one night, clothes dirty, unusually quiet for days afterward. At the time, she had not thought much of it. People changed moods. People had stress. But in hindsight, she described it differently. Like something had followed him home that night. Like something had never fully left him. Detectives left the interview with more questions than answers, but also something more valuable than both, emotional pattern confirmation. Not evidence of guilt, but behavioral alignment with a timeline that refused to separate itself from the victim's disappearance. Back at headquarters, Mercer studied the evolving profile board. Names, dates, locations, and fragments of DNA evidence connected by thin red lines forming a web that no longer looked random. The case was beginning to shape itself into something coherent, something that had always existed but had never been visible with 1990s technology. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. A second piece of evidence from the original box, previously misclassified as irrelevant soil contamination, was retested using modern isotopic analysis. It revealed something subtle but powerful. The soil embedded in the victim's clothing did not originate from the burial site. It originated from a location several miles away. A transitional site. A place where the body had been kept before being moved. That detail changed everything. Because it meant the murder had not been spontaneous. It had been controlled. Staged. Relocated. And that level of planning suggested time, access, and familiarity with the area. Suddenly, the investigation was no longer searching for a stranger passing through. It was searching for someone who had known exactly where they were going. And in Florida's quiet rural corridors, where old roads still remembered names no one spoke anymore, that kind of knowledge was not common. It was personal. And somewhere ahead, in the silence between surveillance reports and reconstructed timelines, Daniel Kessler's life was beginning to tighten around the edges in ways he could not yet see, but would soon feel, as the past he had outrun for decades began slowly, inexorably, to find its way back to him. The first sign that something was about to break came not from the field, not from surveillance, not even from the subject himself, but from a single administrative call that lasted less than 2 minutes and changed the temperature of the entire investigation. A records clerk in a county office had been rechecking archived land use filings tied to rural construction permits from the early 1990s. Most of it was routine cleanup work, digitizing what had once been paper-heavy bureaucracy. Names, signatures, stamps, approvals that no one had looked at in decades. And then she found it. A permit request tied to temporary access clearance near the old Orange Grove corridor. The application had been approved in 1993. The listed contractor name, one of Daniel Kessler's earliest known aliases. It was not a smoking gun. Not even close. But it was placement. Geographic placement. Temporal placement. The kind of quiet administrative footprint that criminals rarely think to erase because it looks too ordinary to matter. But in cold cases, ordinary is often where truth hides. Detective Mercer requested the original physical file immediately. When it arrived, the paper felt brittle, almost fragile, as if the decades had drained it of anything unnecessary. The ink had faded slightly, signatures pressed harder than necessary, like someone trying to make permanence out of something temporary. There was a map attached. Hand-drawn. Simple. Unremarkable at first glance. But when overlaid with modern satellite imaging, it revealed something that had been invisible in 1993 and ignored in 1998. A secondary access path. Not the main road. Not a public route. A private cut-through connecting agricultural land to a cluster of undeveloped acreage behind the orange grove. And next to that path, a handwritten notation. Storage drop zone. No explanation. No context. Just those two words sitting quietly in the margin like an afterthought. The room went silent when Mercer read it aloud. Because suddenly, the investigation was no longer just about a burial site. It was about logistics. Movement. Storage. Control. Someone had not only killed a person, they had managed the aftermath like a process. And processes leave traces. The surveillance team was instructed to tighten observation on Kessler immediately. No contact. No escalation. Just watch. Record. Wait. But waiting, in this case, did not last long. On the fourth night after the map discovery, Kessler did something he had not done since surveillance began. He left his house after midnight. No routine pattern. No predictable errand. Just movement in darkness. The pickup truck rolled out slowly, headlights dimmed more than usual, cutting through empty suburban streets that had long since gone quiet. There was no traffic. No witnesses. Only the faint hum of tires against asphalt and the occasional flicker of streetlights passing overhead like dying pulses. The surveillance units followed at a distance, careful not to close in too tightly. The route was different this time. Not toward the city. Not toward work. But away from everything familiar. Toward the outskirts. Toward the older roads. Toward land that had not fully been absorbed by modern development. Detective Mercer was patched in through radio as the vehicles tracked movement across county lines. He did not speak much. He listened. Every report. Every turn. Every confirmation of direction. Then the truck turned onto a road that had no name on GPS systems updated within the last decade. Just a thin, forgotten stretch of asphalt bordered by trees that leaned inward like they were trying to remember something. The signal grew weaker. Intermittent. Fragmented. The surveillance team switched to manual tracking. The truck eventually stopped. Not at a building. Not at a home. But at the edge of a fenced property line marked with "No Trespassing" signs so old they were barely readable. Beyond the fence, overgrown land. Abandoned agricultural terrain. And deeper inside that land, according to old county records Mercer already had pulled up, sat the remnants of the original Orange Grove development zone. The subject did not exit immediately. He sat in the truck. Engine off now. Lights off. Just darkness. Then, finally, movement. He stepped out. And walked toward the fence. The surveillance team held position, watching through night vision optics as he stood there for several seconds, not climbing, not forcing entry, just looking. Then something unexpected happened. He turned away. Not into the property. Not toward the grove. But back to the truck. And drove off. No deviation. No exploration. Just departure. It should have been disappointing. A failed lead. Another dead end. But Mercer did not see it that way. Because behavior like that did not belong to someone randomly revisiting a place. It belonged to someone restraining themselves. Which meant emotional weight was present. An emotional weight often leads to mistakes. The next morning, investigators moved quickly to cross-reference every known property tied to Kessler's historical aliases. One listing stood out immediately, a short-term equipment storage lease from 1992, located less than 5 miles from the Orange Grove corridor. The facility no longer existed physically, but the land had been redeveloped into a commercial logistics center with underground utility work completed during construction. Mercer ordered a ground scan. The request was unusual, expensive, and slow, but approved due to the evolving nature of the case. Ground-penetrating radar units arrived within days. The scan began in the early morning under a sky that looked too calm for what was happening beneath it. Technicians moved methodically across sections of asphalt and concrete, mapping subsurface anomalies that had been buried under decades of redevelopment. At first, nothing appeared. Uniform density. Standard construction layering. Then the equipment picked up a disruption. A void. Not large, but distinct. Irregular. Artificial. The technicians rerun the scan. Adjusted frequency. Confirmed again. Something had been sealed beneath the original foundation layer before modern construction ever took place. Mercer arrived on site within hours. He stood at the edge of the marked grid zone, staring down at ground that looked completely ordinary. Trucks passed nearby. Workers continued their routines. The world above remained indifferent. But beneath it, something had been waiting. The excavation was authorized under strict supervision. No dramatic digging. No public presence. Just controlled removal of concrete sections, layer by layer, until the subsurface anomaly could be accessed. Hours passed. Then the first sign emerged. A sealed plastic container. Old. Degraded. But intact. When opened, it contained items that immediately froze the excavation team in place. Personal effects. Not random debris. Not construction waste. Personal effects tied to an unidentified individual. Items that had been deliberately stored. Preserved. Hidden. And never reported. Mercer did not speak when he saw them. Because now the case had shifted again. This was no longer about discovery. It was about containment. Someone had taken steps decades earlier to ensure that certain things would never be found, unless someone knew exactly where to look. And that level of control did not come from panic. It came from planning. As the evidence was carefully catalogued and removed, the sky above Florida remained unchanged. Heat rising from concrete. Wind moving through construction barriers. Ordinary life continuing without awareness of what had just been uncovered beneath it. But inside the investigative team, something fundamental had changed. They were no longer chasing fragments. They were following a structure. And structures, once exposed, do not stay hidden for long. Somewhere in Tampa, Daniel Kessler continued living his life under the assumption that time had already finished its job. But time, as this case was now proving, had simply been waiting for the right moment to begin again. The sealed container did not behave like evidence from a typical crime scene. It behaved like intention preserved in plastic. When technicians carefully lifted it from the ground, there was no immediate sense of what it represented, only the unsettling clarity that someone, decades earlier, had chosen this exact depth, this exact location, this exact concealment with deliberate precision. Not rushed. Not improvised. Measured. And that alone changed everything. Because buried objects tell stories, but planned burials tell minds. Inside the forensic unit, the container was opened under controlled conditions, every step documented, every movement slowed as if speed itself might disturb what time had already refused to erase. At first, it looked like nothing more than remnants of ordinary life. A worn fabric wallet. A fractured hairbrush handle. A set of rusted keys that no longer fit any known lock in the modern system. But it was the final item that silenced the room completely. A small notebook. Its cover softened by age, edges warped by humidity, pages stuck together as if they had been trying not to be read for decades. Mercer did not touch it at first. He simply looked at it. Because experience teaches investigators that notebooks rarely contain answers in the way people expect. They contain mindset, routine, repetition, the quiet architecture of behavior that exists before and after violence. When the pages were carefully separated, the ink revealed something worse than clarity. It revealed structure. Dates. Times. Locations. Not in the form of a confession, but in the form of logistics. Entries referencing vehicle mileage, fuel stops, brief coded phrases that repeated with unsettling consistency. Drop completed. Return route clear. No eyes. The language was not emotional, not expressive. It was operational. The kind of writing that does not document feelings, but systems. And somewhere in those pages, investigators found references to a location described only as Grove Site. No address. No coordinates. Just those words, repeated multiple times across different dates spanning nearly 2 years. Each entry aligned with timeframes that matched missing person reports previously considered unrelated. The notebook did not accuse anyone directly. But it did something more precise. It mapped behavior over time. And behavior, unlike memory, does not forget. Mercer requested an immediate forensic linguistic analysis. Not to understand what was written, but how it was written. Patterns began to emerge in the handwriting, subtle shifts suggesting multiple writing sessions under different emotional or situational states. Some entries were rushed. Others were deliberate. A few showed pressure changes consistent with stress or urgency. Then came a detail that shifted the atmosphere in the room. A repeated set of initials appeared in the margins. Not full names. Just 2 letters. DK. The same initials tied to one of Kessler's earliest documented identities. The same initials that now appeared across multiple unrelated evidence points. But still, initials were not proof. They were proximity markers. Interpretations could collapse under scrutiny if not supported by physical linkage. So investigators returned to the container itself. Every fiber. Every trace particle. Every microscopic residue was re-examined using updated contamination filters unavailable in the 1990s. And that is when the second breakthrough occurred. Inside the lining of the container, embedded deep within synthetic material, forensic analysts detected trace soil composition that matched not only the burial site of the victim, but also the transitional staging site identified earlier through isotopic analysis. 2 locations. 2 separate events. 1 container connecting both. That meant the container had not been placed randomly. It had been part of a sequence. Transport. Storage. Burial. And potentially relocation. A chain of actions that implied the existence of multiple controlled phases of concealment. Mercer stood in silence as the report was read aloud. Because now the narrative was no longer fragmented. It was layered. And layered crimes are rarely committed in isolation. They are built. Elsewhere, in Tampa, Kessler's routine continued unchanged on the surface. He went to work. He bought groceries. He exchanged minimal words with people around him. The ordinary rhythm of someone who had mastered invisibility through repetition. But surveillance teams began noticing subtle deviations. Small, almost invisible adjustments in behavior. Route variations that did not appear on the first day of observation. Phone usage that shifted to shorter, encrypted bursts. A sudden increase in nighttime activity that did not align with previous patterns. It was not panic. It was awareness. Something in his environment was telling him, slowly and indirectly, that structure was no longer stable. Mercer authorized a deeper digital pull on all financial and logistical records tied to Kessler's aliases. What emerged was not dramatic, but consistent, a pattern of short-term asset creation followed by rapid dissolution. Bank accounts opened and closed within narrow time windows. Rental agreements that never exceeded 3 months. Vehicles registered under intermediary names that changed every few years. Not a fugitive pattern. A reset pattern. Someone repeatedly erasing continuity before it could accumulate enough weight to become traceable. And then came the witness re-interview that altered the emotional tone of the case entirely. A retired county surveyor, now in his 70s, was brought in after investigators discovered his signature on land boundary adjustments near the Orange Grove region in the early 1990s. He had not been questioned in over 20 years. At first, he struggled to recall anything specific. Names blurred. Dates collapsed into one another. But when he was shown the map recovered from the permit file, something changed in his expression. Not recognition of the map itself, but recognition of the area it described. He hesitated before speaking, then admitted something he had never included in any official statement. There had been unofficial pressure during that time. Requests to quietly adjust access interpretations for private land use. Nothing explicitly illegal. Nothing documented in detail. Just verbal requests from individuals who had connections. When pressed to describe those individuals, he paused again. Then gave a description that aligned loosely with Kessler's known physical profile from that era. But what mattered more was what he said next. He remembered a specific night visit to the survey office. A man asking about soil stability near Groveland. Not threatening. Not aggressive. But intensely focused. Like someone trying to understand how long something would remain hidden if placed beneath certain conditions. At the time, it had seemed like technical curiosity. Now, decades later, it sounded entirely different. It sounded like preparation. Back at headquarters, Mercer reviewed everything laid across the investigation board. DNA traces. Soil analysis. Surveillance logs. Notebook entries. Financial inconsistencies. Witness recollections. Nothing existed in isolation anymore. Every piece was touching another. Every fragment reinforcing structure. And in the center of that structure stood a single unanswered question that no longer felt theoretical. Not who did it, but how long it had been sustained. Because the most disturbing realization in cases like this is not that someone committed a crime. It is that they built a life around ensuring it would never be undone. And yet, despite decades of silence, concealment, and movement, something had finally shifted in the balance. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But irreversibly. And somewhere in that shift, the past was no longer following Kessler from behind. It was beginning to surround him. The investigation did not accelerate all at once. It tightened. Like a net slowly drawn through water, each strand becoming harder to ignore, each movement revealing pressure that had always been there but never fully visible. And in Mercer's experience, that kind of tightening was more dangerous than sudden breakthroughs. Because sudden breakthroughs made people react. Slow tightening made them adapt. And adaptation, in cases like this, was often where mistakes were born. The next lead came from something so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. A discarded maintenance log from a commercial logistics contractor operating near the redevelopment zone where the buried container had been found. Most of it was routine, equipment servicing, asphalt repairs, utility inspections, but one entry stood out because it did not belong in the timeline. A subcontractor had reported an unmarked excavation anomaly during early foundation work years after the original land redevelopment. The note had been flagged at the time, then dismissed, because nothing physical was ever officially documented. No photographs. No escalation report. Just a single line in a long-forgotten log. Possible pre-existing subsurface void, filled and sealed prior to current construction layer. At the time, it had been interpreted as geological irregularity. Now, it aligned too precisely with the sealed container discovery. Mercer requested the original construction crew roster from that period. Many names were gone, companies dissolved, workers retired, some deceased, but one detail emerged from payroll records that tightened the pattern further. A short-term labor contractor listed under a temporary hiring agency tied to multiple aliases associated with Kessler's identity trail. It was not direct employment proof. But it was proximity again. Always proximity. And proximity, in this case, was becoming impossible to ignore. The surveillance team reported a new behavioral shift that same evening. Kessler had changed his routine. Subtle at first. Earlier departures. Shorter stops. Increased time spent away from his residence without clear destination patterns. But what concerned Mercer was not movement. It was hesitation. Every time Kessler approached a known route out of his neighborhood, there was a brief delay. Not enough to be obvious to an untrained observer, but consistent enough to be measurable. Like someone recalculating risk in real time. The system was no longer invisible to him. He just did not know how much of it had already closed around him. That night, Mercer authorized a controlled escalation. Not an arrest. Not yet. But a strategic pressure test. A fabricated administrative audit was initiated through a financial compliance channel tied to one of Kessler's dormant accounts. The goal was simple: observe reaction without revealing investigative presence. Within hours, something changed. The account, inactive for nearly 7 years, was accessed. Not heavily. Not recklessly. But carefully. A single login. A brief transaction attempt. Then immediate withdrawal from activity. The system logged it as suspicious but inconclusive. To Mercer, it was confirmation. Kessler was checking exposure. And people do not check exposure unless they believe exposure is possible. The next morning, investigators revisited witness statements from the original 1990s case file. This time, they focused not on what was said, but what was overlooked. One statement in particular resurfaced. A local delivery driver who had reported seeing a man loading covered objects into the back of a truck near rural land late one night. At the time, it had been dismissed as unrelated to the missing person case because the driver could not provide a precise date. But now, investigators cross-referenced fuel purchase records, weather patterns, and known work logs tied to Kessler's aliases. The window narrowed. From weeks to days. Then to a single night. A night in late 1993. Heavy rain. Low visibility. Sparse traffic. Conditions ideal for concealment activity. And most importantly, a night where multiple systems, employment logs, vehicle registrations, and temporary housing records, all overlapped within the same geographic corridor. Mercer stared at the reconstructed timeline for a long time without speaking. Because what he was looking at was not just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of opportunity carefully used. An opportunity, when repeated, becomes methodology. Meanwhile, the forensic team returned to the notebook recovered from the sealed container. A second pass through the pages revealed something previously overlooked due to ink fading and page adhesion. Between two dated entries, hidden beneath overlapping handwriting, was a phrase written in lighter pressure, almost concealed within margin space. If Grove fails, move south line. It was not a confession. It was contingency planning. Alternate routing. Backup concealment strategy. And it implied something investigators had not yet fully considered: there were likely additional sites. Multiple. Not just one burial location. Not just one storage point. But a network of controlled spaces designed to distribute risk across geography. Mercer ordered immediate mapping expansion. Every known property linked to Kessler's aliases. Every rural lease. Every short-term utility connection. Every temporary agricultural contract in central and northern Florida between 1990 and 1995. What emerged over the next 48 hours was unsettling. 3 locations showed overlapping anomalies in historical land use combined with short-duration occupancy. 1 had been converted into residential housing. 1 into industrial storage. And 1 remained undeveloped, still classified as protected wetlands with restricted access. The team did not yet know what they would find. But pattern recognition was no longer theoretical. It was directional. And direction was pulling them towards something larger than a single crime scene. At the same time, Kessler made a decision that surprised surveillance teams. He visited a bank in person. Not digitally. Not remotely. Physically. He withdrew a significant amount of cash from a long-standing account that had remained mostly dormant. The transaction was legal. Clean. Within limits. But the behavior was not. People who feel safe do not extract themselves from systems. They remain inside them. The withdrawal suggested preparation. Mobility. Exit thinking. Mercer was informed immediately. This time, the response was different. No further delays. No extended observation. The net was no longer being adjusted. It was ready. But Mercer did not order immediate arrest. Because something about the structure still felt incomplete. And incomplete structures, if disturbed too early, collapse in ways that destroy context. Instead, he authorized final convergence on all 3 identified sites simultaneously. A coordinated sweep. Controlled. Quiet. Precise. No public announcement. No media attention. Just investigators moving into positions that had been years in the making. And as night fell over Florida again, the same quiet that had once protected a buried truth now became the stage for its final exposure. Somewhere ahead, buried beneath layers of time, construction, and silence, the full shape of what had happened was waiting. Not hidden anymore. Just undiscovered. And discovery, once initiated, does not stop until everything underneath finally answers back. The coordinated sweep did not begin with noise. It began with silence so controlled it almost felt artificial. 3 sites. 3 teams. 1 synchronized clock. No sirens. No public presence. Only unmarked vehicles moving through backroads under low light, each unit carrying the same understanding: whatever they found would not be isolated. It would be connected. Mercer remained at command coordination, watching the live feeds come in as digital overlays mapped their positions against decades-old land records. Every second felt stretched, not because of uncertainty about execution, but because of anticipation of what execution might reveal. The first site was the wetlands property. Undeveloped. Restricted. Overgrown in a way that suggested nature had reclaimed authority, but not completely erased history. Technicians moved carefully, their boots sinking slightly into damp soil that had not been disturbed in years. Ground-penetrating radar scans were deployed in a grid formation, each pass feeding data into a central system. At first, nothing. Uniform readings. Natural density. Water saturation. Then a disruption. A linear anomaly. Not random. Not geological. Structured. The technician reran the scan twice before reporting it. Something beneath the surface had been shaped intentionally. Not recently, but long enough ago that the surrounding soil had adapted to its presence. Mercer listened through the radio channel without responding immediately, because confirmation at one site was expected. The question had never been whether anomalies existed. It was how many. The second site, industrial storage redevelopment, moved faster. Concrete sections were partially removed under supervision, revealing older foundational layers beneath modern construction. The excavation was precise, surgical, avoiding unnecessary disturbance. And then it appeared. A second sealed container. Smaller than the first, but identical in material composition. When lifted, it was heavier than expected, not because of mass, but because of implication. Every object retrieved from the earlier discovery now gained context through repetition. Patterns becoming physical. Inside, the forensic team found items that immediately shifted the emotional weight of the operation. Not weapons. Not dramatic artifacts. But personal identifiers. A wristwatch stopped at a specific time. A set of folded receipts from multiple counties. A torn photograph with the face deliberately removed. And beneath it all, a folded piece of paper containing a list of dates. Each date matched a missing person report from early Florida databases. Each one previously categorized as unrelated. Now aligned. The room did not react verbally. There was no need. Because alignment like that does not suggest coincidence. It suggests coordination. Mercer finally spoke over the channel. Confirm containment. Document everything. Do not disturb further layers. His voice remained steady, but the meaning behind it had changed. This was no longer exploratory investigation. It was structural mapping of something that had been deliberately constructed across geography and time. Then came the third site. The one that had concerned Mercer from the beginning. The rural access zone. Still technically undeveloped land, though partially reclaimed by unauthorized footpaths and decades of erosion. Unlike the other two sites, this one did not require excavation equipment immediately. Because the anomaly revealed itself almost visually. A subtle depression in terrain that did not match natural erosion patterns. A faint irregularity in tree spacing, as if something underground had once influenced what grew above it. And then the scan confirmed it. A void. Larger than the previous two combined. But not empty. Structured. Segmented. Like compartments. Mercer felt the first genuine shift in the case at that moment, not surprise, but recognition of scale. Because now it was no longer a question of isolated concealment events. It was architecture. Deliberate spatial planning across multiple sites. The kind of planning that requires time, access, and most importantly, confidence that nothing would ever be challenged. The excavation authorization came quickly. And carefully. But before digging began, a final unexpected complication emerged. Surveillance reported movement at Kessler's residence. He was not leaving. He was packing. Not hastily. Not chaotically. Methodically. Clothing. Documents. Small items. Nothing large enough to suggest immediate flight, but enough to suggest preparation for extended absence. Then he stopped. Sat down. Did nothing for nearly 20 minutes. Just sitting. Watching. Listening. As if something internal had reached a threshold only he could perceive. Mercer was informed. For the first time since the operation began, he ordered a contingency escalation. Prepare intercept units. Quiet engagement only if he moves. But Kessler did not move. Instead, he did something that surveillance analysts later described as behavioral rupture without action. He stood up, walked to his vehicle, started the engine, and drove. Not toward highways, not toward airports, but west, directly toward the rural convergence zone. The third site. The largest anomaly. The one investigators had not yet opened. The convoy tracking him did not accelerate immediately. Mercer wanted confirmation of intent, not reaction to motion. But within minutes, it became clear that Kessler was not wandering. He was heading somewhere specific. Somewhere he already knew. At command, Mercer stood still for several seconds, watching two streams converge on his display screen, investigative units approaching the third site from one direction, and Kessler approaching from another. Not intersecting randomly. Approaching the same point. The implication was immediate. He was not escaping. He was returning. Or more precisely, he was going back to something he believed still belonged to him. At the third site, excavation had not yet begun. Teams were staged, awaiting final confirmation. Ground scans continued to feed data into the system, refining the shape of what lay beneath. And then the first physical disturbance occurred naturally. A section of soil near the edge of the anomaly collapsed slightly after overnight moisture shift, exposing a fragment of synthetic material just beneath the surface. A tulp. Old. Fused with earth. Preserved in layers of sediment. Mercer ordered immediate halt on all excavation. Because now timing mattered differently. Whatever was beneath that ground was not just evidence. It was connected to the person currently driving toward it. And when investigators understand that a suspect is moving toward a location already containing buried truth, the equation changes from discovery to confrontation. Kessler arrived 43 minutes later. His truck stopped at the edge of the access path leading into the site perimeter. No lights. No urgency. Just engine idling in darkness. Surveillance units maintained distance, waiting for confirmation. Then he stepped out. And for the first time in the entire investigation, he did not hesitate. He walked directly toward the site boundary. Not running. Not fleeing. Walking. Purposefully. As if distance itself had become irrelevant. Mercer's voice came over the channel immediately. Hold positions. No engagement unless initiated. The teams froze. Watching. Waiting. Kessler crossed into the outer perimeter. Stopped at the edge where excavation markers had been placed. And looked down at the ground. Not searching. Not confused. Recognizing. A silence stretched across every channel. Then Kessler spoke for the first time in recorded surveillance. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly enough for nearby microphones to capture fragments. Still here. 2 words. Barely enough to qualify as a sentence. But enough to change the entire emotional temperature of the case. Because that statement did not belong to someone discovering something. It belonged to someone confirming it. And confirmation, in this context, meant memory. Mercer did not respond immediately. He simply watched the display as the final phase of the operation aligned itself into place. Suspect present, evidence beneath ground, investigative teams surrounding perimeter, and decades of silence about to be breached by controlled excavation. Then, from command, he gave the final instruction. Begin recovery protocol. And as excavation teams moved forward under night conditions, the ground that had concealed truth for more than 20 years finally prepared to give it back. The moment excavation began, the site changed character. Not visually. Not immediately. But perceptually, like everyone present had crossed an invisible threshold where the land was no longer just terrain, but testimony. Floodlights were adjusted downward to avoid glare, casting long, controlled shadows across marked grids. Technicians moved in coordinated silence, their equipment humming softly beneath the Florida night, each tool calibrated not for speed, but for preservation. Mercer remained at command position, watching both the ground feed and Kessler's live movement in the same frame. Two realities unfolding in parallel, one human, one buried. Kessler had not moved further. He stood at the perimeter line, just beyond active excavation, eyes fixed downward as if he could already see what others were still trying to uncover. No attempt to flee. No attempt to interfere. Only stillness, dense, deliberate, and unsettling in its restraint. The first layer of soil came up clean. Then the second. Then the third. Each pass revealing not destruction, but intention laid beneath time. At approximately 40 minutes into the excavation, a technician's shovel struck something that did not belong to Earth. The sound was wrong. Too hollow. Too controlled. He stopped immediately, raised a hand, and signaled the team. Mercer leaned forward slightly. Mark location. Switch to manual removal only. The tools changed. Brushes. Hand trowels. Vacuum extraction. Every motion slowed, every grain of soil treated as if it carried memory. And then it emerged. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. A reinforced panel. Composite material. Weather-sealed. Buried at a depth that suggested deliberate concealment rather than environmental collapse. There was no immediate label. No obvious marking. Just industrial precision beneath organic decay. One of the technicians exhaled quietly without realizing it. Mercer did not. Because this was the moment cold cases rarely survive. Not the discovery. But the proximity to truth. At the perimeter, Kessler shifted slightly for the first time in nearly an hour. A subtle adjustment of stance. Weight redistribution. A human reaction so small it almost disappeared into stillness. But surveillance caught it. And Mercer saw it. Hold all units, Mercer said calmly. No movement unless he advances. The panel was carefully exposed over the next 30 minutes. Hydraulic supports were unnecessary. This was not structural collapse. It was intentional concealment within stable ground. When the edges were finally cleared, technicians identified something critical. A sealed access compartment. Not large. But engineered. With fastening points still intact. The kind used for storage. Or containment. A long silence settled across the channel. Then Mercer issued the next instruction. Open. No hesitation. No delay. The seal was cut. The compartment released with a low mechanical sigh that felt almost unnatural in its timing, as if the structure itself had been waiting to be acknowledged. Inside, the air that escaped carried decades of isolation. Dry. Preserved. Wrong in a way that made the instinctive reaction immediate. The interior was organized. Not randomly filled. Not discarded. Arranged. Stacked items. Wrapped objects. Containers labeled in handwriting that had faded but not disappeared. And at the center, a larger object wrapped in multiple layers of protective material. The team did not touch it immediately. Mercer stepped closer to the monitor feed. Document everything before contact. The technicians complied. Photographs. Angles. Measurements. Then carefully, slowly, they began unwrapping the central bundle. Layer 1. Layer 2. Layer 3. Each layer revealing deeper preservation effort. Then finally. Fabric. Human-sized. Folded. Contained. The forensic team froze for a fraction of a second that no training could fully eliminate. Mercer did not speak. Because every investigator in the system recognized what that shape implied before it was even fully revealed. Kessler remained outside the perimeter. Still watching. Still not moving. But now something in his posture had changed. Not panic. Not shock. Recognition. As if the process unfolding beneath the ground was not discovery to him, but completion. The final layer was removed. And the contents inside were no longer ambiguous. Human remains. Carefully preserved by environmental conditions and deliberate sealing. Not scattered. Not disturbed by nature. Contained. The silence that followed was absolute. Even radio channels seemed to hesitate. Mercer closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in emotion, but in calculation. Because this changed classification entirely. This was no longer a single homicide case. It was controlled concealment following death. And possibly multiple stages of handling afterward. He opened his eyes. Secure the site. Expand perimeter. No one enters or exits without authorization. At the edge of the site, Kessler finally spoke again. This time, louder. Not shouting. But enough for proximity capture. I didn't move it. The words landed differently than expected. Not denial in panic. Not confession. Something colder. A correction. Mercer turned slightly toward the feed but did not respond. Because experienced investigators recognize when language is not meant for persuasion. It is meant for alignment. Kessler stepped forward one pace. Not crossing the line. Just closer. And added. It was already there when I came back. That statement changed the atmosphere more than the discovery itself. Because it introduced uncertainty into structure. And uncertainty, in cases built on long timelines, is dangerous. Mercer immediately ordered a pause in further excavation. Stop all removal. Preserve current state. The technicians froze mid-motion. The compartment remained open. The remains remained partially exposed. The night air held stillness that felt heavier than before. Mercer walked a few steps away from the command console, thinking, not reacting, but reconstructing mentally what had just been said. Kessler was not denying involvement. He was distancing origin. And that distinction mattered. Because if true, it meant the site predated his final confirmed activity timeline. Which meant either the investigation had the wrong temporal anchor, or the site had been reused, revisited, recontextualized, or worse, shared. Mercer returned to the console. Maintain containment. Begin full forensic layering analysis of site chronology. I want soil stratification report within the hour. At that moment, the case stopped being linear. It became layered in a way that no longer allowed simple cause and effect interpretation. And above it all, Kessler stood at the edge of the perimeter, looking not at the investigators, not at the machinery, but at the ground itself, as if whatever lay beneath was not just evidence of a crime, but evidence of something that had already been in motion long before anyone realized it had begun. The soil stratification report arrived faster than Mercer expected, but nothing about its contents felt fast. It felt heavy. Like the ground itself had taken time to admit what it had been hiding. The analysis came in layered sections, each one stripping away assumptions built over the last 72 hours of excavation. Technicians projected the data onto a shared display, where colored depth bands represented time, disturbance, and material deposition. At first glance, it looked consistent. Then the inconsistencies began to emerge. The topmost layers, modern backfill, construction-era soil compression, utility trench disruptions, were exactly as expected. But beneath that, the signature changed. Not gradually. Abruptly. A distinct separation between two eras of disturbance. Mercer leaned closer. Explain that transition. The geologist on the team hesitated before answering. It's not a natural shift, she said. It's a reset boundary. The phrase lingered in the air. Reset boundary. A term not commonly used in forensic geology, because it implied intention rather than formation. She continued. There are two distinct stratified disturbance events. One older, one significantly newer. The newer layer doesn't match the timeline of the original burial estimate. Mercer did not speak immediately. He simply stared at the data. Because what that meant was simple and unacceptable in its implications. The site had been altered after the initial concealment. Someone had returned. Not decades ago. Later. Much later. The forensic team zoomed into the deeper layers. The older disturbance matched the original 1990s burial estimate almost perfectly. Compression patterns, moisture retention, decomposition markers, all aligned with long-established conclusions. But above it, the newer layer told a different story. Compacted soil. Mechanical disturbance signatures. And most importantly, tool impact patterns inconsistent with excavation but consistent with partial reopening and resealing. Someone had accessed the site again. And carefully restored it. Mercer's expression tightened. Timestamp estimate. The geologist checked the secondary calibration output. Based on degradation and sediment displacement between 4 and 7 years ago. The room went still. Because that placed activity well outside the original investigative window. Long after the case had gone cold. Long after official interest had faded. Long after the world had stopped watching. At the perimeter, Kessler was still standing in the same position. But surveillance now showed subtle changes. His head had tilted slightly. Not toward investigators. Toward the excavation site itself. Listening. Or remembering. Mercer stepped away from the display and addressed the team. Confirm all soil layers. I want separation between original deposition and secondary intrusion fully mapped. Then he paused. And identify whether the remains were disturbed during the second event. That question changed everything. Because if the remains had been moved during the later intrusion, then the current discovery was not the original burial context. It was a reconstruction. Minutes passed. Then the forensic lead spoke quietly. There's evidence of repositioning. Mercer turned immediately. Clarify. She pointed at the visualization. The remains were not stationary through the entire timeline. There are displacement markers inconsistent with natural settling. They were adjusted. A word like adjusted carries weight in forensic language. It avoids emotional framing while still acknowledging intent. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose. So someone accessed the body after initial burial. Yes. And returned it. Yes. Silence again. Because the implication was no longer just criminal. It was procedural. Deliberate interaction with remains long after death. A second phase of control. At that moment, a radio call came in from the third site team, the wetland zone. Their tone had changed. Not urgent. Controlled. But tense. We've confirmed structural anomalies beneath the primary grid. Multiple voids. Not singular. Repeating pattern. Mercer responded immediately. Define repeating. A pause. Multiple sealed compartments. Similar composition to Site 2. Smaller scale, but consistent engineering method. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Then opened them. 3 sites. 3 structures. 1 behavioral signature. This was no longer about a single concealed event. It was distribution architecture. A system. Not a burial. A network. And networks require maintenance. Which meant interaction. Which meant return visits. Which meant Kessler, or someone connected to him, had not simply buried something and walked away. They had maintained it. Across time. At the perimeter of Site 3, Kessler suddenly turned his head slightly, as if responding to something no one else could hear. Then he took a step backward. Not toward escape. Not toward confrontation. Just away from the boundary. Mercer noticed immediately. Hold all units. Do not pursue unless he crosses perimeter. But Kessler did not cross. Instead, he stopped. And spoke again, louder this time. You're digging the wrong layer. The words were carried clearly across proximity microphones. Wrong layer. Not wrong site. Not wrong person. Wrong layer. That distinction hit Mercer harder than any physical evidence so far. Because it suggested awareness of stratification. Awareness of sequence. And sequence implied participation in something structured. Mercer turned slightly toward the speaker feed. Kessler, remain where you are. No response to command. Only continuation. They didn't stay buried the first time. The statement was incomplete. Deliberately so. As if the rest of the sentence belonged to someone else. Or another moment. Mercer signaled for silence on all channels except direct capture. Then he stepped forward within the command perimeter, speaking calmly. What do you mean by that? A pause. Long enough for tension to accumulate into something almost physical. Then Kessler answered. Not looking at Mercer. Not looking at the team. Still focused on the ground. They moved it. A shift in the team's posture. Mercer's voice remained controlled. Who moved it? Kessler did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly, not defensive, not emotional, but fractured in a way that suggested memory conflict. Not me. Another pause. Then. Not originally. The words did not resolve anything. They expanded uncertainty. Which in Mercer's experience was more dangerous than silence. Because uncertainty leads to reinterpretation. And reinterpretation leads to collapse of established narrative. Behind Mercer, the forensic team continued mapping soil layers, now working faster, re-examining every assumption about the site chronology. Then one technician called out. Wait, we have a mismatch. Mercer turned. The technician pointed at a sublayer scan. This interface marker, it doesn't match our earlier stratification model. What does it match? Mercer asked. A pause. Then the answer. Manual resealing. Not just disturbance. Controlled restoration. Mercer looked back toward Kessler. Now standing completely still again. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time since excavation began, Mercer considered a possibility that had not yet been fully acknowledged. That the person standing at the perimeter was not reacting to discovery. but confirming what had already been altered long before investigators arrived. And somewhere beneath their feet, the ground was no longer just revealing truth. It was revealing that truth itself had been handled more than once. The phrase, controlled restoration, did not leave the room. It stayed there, suspended in the air like something unfinished. Mercer had heard a lot of forensic interpretations over the years: accidental disturbance, environmental compression, secondary contamination, but controlled restoration belonged to a different category entirely. It implied intent after the fact. It implied someone had returned to a place that should have been final, and made it look final again. And that changed the entire logic of the investigation. Because finality is what cold cases depend on. Without it, nothing is stable. The command team rerun the stratigraphy model from Site 3, isolating the interface boundary between the original deposition layer and the secondary intrusion layer. What emerged was not just a discrepancy in time, but in technique. The original burial layer showed chaotic compression consistent with emergency concealment under pressure, soil displacement, uneven compaction, irregular void formation. It matched everything expected from a clandestine burial in the early 1990s. But the upper restoration layer told a different story. It was deliberate. Measured. Even. Too even. The kind of soil releveling that does not come from concealment under stress, but from someone trying to erase evidence of disturbance after the fact. One of the analysts finally voiced what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say aloud. This wasn't just hidden. A pause. It was managed. Mercer didn't respond immediately. His attention was split now between the excavation feed and Kessler at the perimeter. The suspect had not moved for several minutes, but something about his stillness had shifted. It no longer felt like observation. It felt like anticipation. As if he was waiting for the investigation to reach a specific point before anything else could happen. Then the wetlands team radioed again. Their voice carried a different kind of urgency now, not panic, but compression. We've expanded the grid. We're getting repeating structural signatures beneath the secondary anomaly zones. This is not isolated. Mercer leaned in. Clarify. A short delay. Then. There are alignment patterns. Subsurface compartments are not random. They're positioned relative to each other. Almost mirrored spacing. The word mirrored immediately drew Mercer's attention. Mirrored how? The analyst hesitated. Like they were planned as a set. The room went still again. A set.